welcome, Immigrant Nation. Another week, another new episode. I am Aaron Del Yosa, and this is An Immigrant's Life podcast. An Immigrant's Life on all the social media where you can find the good stuff, extra content, and if you want to reach out, if you want to come on the podcast as a guest, or if you know someone that has a beautiful story that they might want to share, reach out there, or you can also send an email at animmigrantlife@yahoo.com. Every week, I try to share some insight in my life, but this week, I felt like I don't even remember what I did. I did a lot, but I don't remember it. So, also, we have an amazing episode, and I think we should just go straight to that because in today's episode, we delved into a compelling discussion about a new book that intertwines generational immigrant experiences with personal narrative. Our guest explores the complex journey of immigration, starting with his father's arrival in the U.S. under challenging circumstances. We also tackle America's mixed feelings towards immigrants, the evolving landscape of journalism, and the intricate process of memoir writing, including the nuances of memory. Join us for an insightful conversation that navigates these themes with depth and perspective. And without further ado, let's get into the show. Isa, dalawa, tatlo. Today's guest is a journalist, an author, and an amateur historian. In short, every Asian parent's dream son. Everyone, please welcome William Gee Wong.
Thank you.
How do you, Mr. William?
I'm doing fine. Thank you. Thank you.
Should I call you William, or I know you like
Call me
being
Bill.
called
Just call me
Bill?
Bill. Yeah.
Bill? All right, that works with me. First of all, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really do appreciate it.
Yes.
And since before we begin, why don't you tell the Immigrant Nation where they can reach you, or if you want to promote anything?
Well, I want to talk about my book, Sons of Chinatown, a memoir rooted in China and America, William Gee Wong. My website is williamgwong, all one word, lowercase.com.
Beautiful. Do you have Instagram or anything like that?
I am not on social media, and I know that I'm way beyond, I'm behind the times. But my website, contact me through my website.
Perfect. That works. Let's get into it. What inspired the book?
What inspired the book was my desire to sort of document and put on the record my father's immigration history, which is not well known in America, because he came from China during the Chinese Exclusion Act era. In 1882, the U.S. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to basically greatly reduce and even eliminate the presence of the Chinese in America. This was way back in 1882.
Wow.
It lasted until 1943. Now, in that 61-year period, right almost in the middle of that, my father came from China. In 1912, he came to California, landed in Oakland, California. And in 1933, he stayed in Oakland for a while, then went back several times, got married, fathered 3 daughters. In 1933, he decided to bring them to Oakland to live with him and settle with him permanently. And so I have a mother, a father, 3 older sisters who were born in China. And then when in Oakland, he had 4 more children, 3 sisters older than me, and then me. So in all, he had 7 children, 6 daughters, 3 of the daughters born in China, 3 of the daughters born in Oakland, and then I came along.
Busy man.
I thought that was an interesting story, but I really wanted to tell the story about a Chinese immigrant who came during the Chinese exclusion era. Came, he was entered legally using false papers. So, in a way, he was an illegal immigrant, but entered legally. And then he had children in Oakland. And then from that point on, after the exclusion law was repealed, it then allowed me and my sisters to gradually join the American mainstream. And so I see it as an illegal immigration success story, meaning there was some negative aspects of the entry of some members of my family, but eventually his children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren have been able to integrate and assimilate into America, and we're all of us are productive, tax-paying, law-abiding Americans of
There's so
Chinese ancestry.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I want to start with exclusion law. Let's talk about that a little bit. I'm pretty sure a lot of people doesn't know what an exclusion law is.
Right. It really goes back to let me just very briefly reference the arrival of significant numbers of Chinese to America. Goes back to the gold rush of 1849. Gold was discovered in California in 1848 when California was not yet a state. San Francisco did not exist as a city. But after the discovery of gold, it took a little while for the word to get around the world that there was gold in the California, somewhere to be found. So that really set off a worldwide migration to California. Again, before California was California. Among them were some Chinese from the southeastern area, which is today kind of known as the Pearl River Delta near Hong Kong. So that was the beginning. The reception of these miners, and then later the people, Chinese workers who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad in California, in America, were greeted with hostility and racism and violence. And so in 1882, Congress passed the 1880 Chinese Exclusion Act, which then greatly reduced the Chinese presence, when in fact the numbers of Chinese in America at the time very teeny, very small, way below 1%.
And
And
the law is really says like Chinese exclusion law.
yes,
That's
yes,
crazy.
it was the only American law that targeted a specific ethnic group. Uh, But as I said, it lasted 60 years. It was repealed in 1943. And then things began to allow those of us of Chinese descent to uh, join the American mainstream. But there's also an interesting linkage to other Asian immigrants because when the exclusion law was passed in 1882, the some of the big employers in America still needed labor. So then Japanese, either from directly from Japan or through Hawaii, which again was not part of the United States, brought in sort of as substitute laborers for the Chinese that were excluded. Then, after the Japanese got into some problems with being here, Filipinos were brought in, basically almost like in the early 1900s in larger groups to fill the labor shortage. So the linkages between the Chinese immigrants, the Japanese immigrants, and the Filipino immigrants, and later a little bit Koreans, those four Asian ethnic groups were largely involved in helping build America before World War II.
So they keep on just going on the list, right? Like Chinese, Japanese.
Yeah, right, right. That was kind of. the way it worked back then.
That
So
is insane.
yeah.
So I know your dad came to America with the papers that called son of a native. What is that?
Yeah, that was one category of legal entry. And that basically meant that he had to either declare or prove that he was the son of somebody born in the United States.
And who's the lucky man?
Well, this man was my father's paper father, a guy named G. Bing Fong. I'll just use it as a GBF, right? And he said he was born in San Francisco in 1870. Then he went back to China, tried to come back in 1890. But at that time, the Chinese exclusion law had just been passed. The some official, when he tried to get back in 1890, when he was 20 years old, said, no, you can't come in. So his case went to a U.S. district judge in San Francisco. I have the paperwork of the ruling of this judge who ruled that GBF was born in San Francisco in 1870. That made him a native. So from that point on, GBF could list his children, he said, were born in China, right? So he had a list of 7 children. My father was on paper his second son. All right.
Okay.
And then eventually at number 7 was a girl. And eventually my mother became GBF's only daughter, child number 7. I know it sounds very confusing, but that was the way. I have paperwork that shows all of this, right? So that was the paper son, paper daughter scheme, which was the way that Chinatown leaders in America were able to get around the restrictions of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
I love it.
I'm not advocating people breaking the law, but I want people to think about the idea of the many people from around the world, even today, want to come to America, and some of them can't get legal papers.
Yeah.
And to me, it says something about America still being a place that people want to come to make a better life.
Yeah, of course. It's still, as much as people says that, oh, America's this and that, like, I think it's still number one. People still want to go to America,
Yeah.
And yes, yeah, of course, we're not advocating us breaking the law and all of that stuff. I mean, it still happens today. People marrying someone just to get to America,
Yes.
a lot of ways, you're getting some. I know people personally that were offered if they want to marry someone for money. And you know what? Some people do it, some people don't.
Right.
You got to do what you got to do.
Do what you got to do. And there still are many opportunities in this country for people who want to come here and make a better life
Yeah.
for them and the families from the countries where they came from.
Yeah. In the topic of that, how would you retort to people claiming that, oh, America's not good anymore and this is not the best country anymore?
I actually have an interesting kind of back and forth on that because in my family story, which I tell in Sons of Chinatown, it really is an inspirational, positive story about immigration, even under these negative circumstances. At the same time, our country, America, is still having some internal conflict with the idea of whether or not America welcomes immigrants and gives people from other countries and other cultures opportunities to be productive and to make a better living. That still is the case because I see examples after examples, even today, where people come in legally, I hope, maybe slightly illegally, you don't know. They seize some opportunities and they do well. At the same time, we do know that a portion of America does not welcome people from other countries, especially non-white countries. So we still have that problem. It is still a big political issue in our forthcoming presidential election. We all hear about the border crisis, especially from Mexico and Central America. So we are still in a contradictory sort of, we're battling ourselves as to whether America is what I call the good America versus the bad America.
100%. I was listening to a podcast. I think it's Dan Carlin. He was talking about America, and he said that America's like a schizophrenic person. Like 1 minute, very kind to immigrants. The next minute, like he hates immigrants.
Yes.
You know, like when they expand to the east with the Philippines, when they said, that, "Oh, we should not take advantage of other people, but also we need to take care of them."
Yes, yes, yes.
You mentioned that your pops, which I love, by the way, how you addressed him. Your pops moved to Oakland. Why Oakland? Is it because of GBF? That's where he lives?
No, there was apparently, and this is hard to know, but I'm speculating, and I think my speculation is spot on. There were others from my father's little area where he came from who had come to Oakland, maybe a member of the same clan, meaning a distant relative. So there was somebody in Oakland who had a pharmacy shop, pharmacy, I mean, that sold Chinese. A deal made that the person from my father's area from the same clan had a shop in Oakland and had space for my father, who was then a teenager, to come and learn the business and to live there, which is a kind of a familiar kind of immigrant pattern, actually. So
But
Oakland was the place.
that's I love stories like that. The craziness of it. That that far far away place that you don't know anything about.
Correct.
We know someone there that's
Yeah,
somehow connected to us. Go over there, get on the boat,
yeah.
go over there, and figure it out.
Well, but at least there was a connection. There are other people who may come and say, "Wow, where am I? Where do I go? I may have a few dollars, so
Yeah, I guess so. You mentioned earlier that you're the only son of your pops, right?
yeah.
And I know Chinese culture, the boys are like golden, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Did it give you more freedom to pursue whatever you like compared to your other siblings?
Oh, absolutely. That was the case. One story is that when I was born, one of the customs in Chinatown was that people would give the new child, especially a boy, money in red envelopes. They were called hong bao, right?
We still use that.
Oh, yes, yes. But I collected a lot, whereas my sisters did not collect a lot. So my father put that money into a bank account for my future college education, right? So my couple of my older sisters wanted to go to college, and the University of California at Berkeley is only 5 miles away from Oakland in Berkeley. So when my two of my older sisters wanted to go to Cal, my parents, especially my mother, said, "No, we're not going to help you. We need you at the restaurant," which was the family business. Because the sort of the theory is that, and here is where the patriarchy of Chinatown comes in, not the only culture that has that, by the way, was that women would eventually marry, have children, and then go to the husband's family. The boy is the one who will carry the family name and be the one who will carry on the family honor. So I didn't choose this. They wanted me. So that was one indication where I had favorite treatment. But my sisters and I actually got along very well, other than standard sibling conflicts and rivalries. There's no perfect relationship anywhere. And right now, I have two sisters who are still with me. Uh, I've lost four of them already, and we get along.
That's beautiful. So growing up, being pretty much, you know, you are allowed to do whatever you want to do, pretty much. Did you and your siblings not really? Did you feel guilt growing up?
No, I mentioned that we had a family business that was a restaurant. So for the first roughly for 18 of the first 20 years of my life, I was attached to the restaurant, even though when I was real young, I didn't work there. So when I became older, I joined my sisters working in the restaurant. So in that regards, my parents didn't give me any special favors. So I was, along with my older sisters, all needed to work in this family restaurant. So in that regards, I don't see me getting any special favors. It was more my parents putting aside some money for me and kind of putting the idea that I was the only one going to college. But
Okay.
from that point on, we operated like brothers and sisters anywhere.
Makes sense. You are an accomplished writer, but a usual immigrant child of an immigrant path is not writing.
Correct.
How did you sell that to mom and dad when you decided to be a writer?
Well, they didn't exactly like what I had chosen for a possible career. I found out when I started learning English at the public school near Chinatown, I really took to the English language and I really lost my native dialect, which was a offshoot of Cantonese. Um, so I began to read widely newspapers, novels. Um, I liked sports. I listened to radio, listened to American sports. Wanted to be an athlete, but I'm not very tall, nor was I very good. So the second best thing I said, let me write about it because I was reading the sports pages of the Oakland Tribune and I loved it. I listened to sports on radio. So I began to learn American sports. Again, not a great athlete, even though I wanted to be. So the second best thing was to write about it. And that got me into writing. And then when I went to high school, I was writing sports for the newspaper, became the editor of my school yearbook. When I went to Cal, I became a sports writer, became the sports editor of the Daily Californian, which was the newspaper at Cal. And eventually, I got a job at my first professional job in 1962 at the San Francisco Chronicle, which was the leading newspaper at that time in San Francisco. And from that point on, except I took a little break to join the Peace Corps and served in the Philippines for a little bit more than 3 years in the mid 1960s. But with that interruption, I went back to Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, and then I got more work in newspaper journalism until I retired.
Did mom and dad eventually accepted you being a writer since you're like doing well anyway?
Well, my answer would have to be probably not because my father died before I became a professional journalist. And he and my mother really wanted me to be, and you get this as the Asian stereotype, a doctor or maybe an architect, right? And I keep saying to myself, I'm glad I didn't do that because I would have been terrible, at those things, which shows you that you have to somehow discover where your interests and your skills are and what you like to do, as opposed to meet uh, the desire of your parents who want you to do something that would be honorable for your family, because, being a doctor is a profession of great honor. And in those days, and maybe even today, doctors make a lot of money.
Yeah, stability. That's what they're looking for.
Right.
Stability and honor.
Right. But as I said, I loved writing sports, and then later on general news. And I did have a successful newspaper career. I had an earlier book published about in 2001 called Yellow Journalist Dispatches from Asian America, which is a collection of my journalism writing about Asian American in all sorts of different pursuits and different topics. And then my latest book, Sons of Chinatown, which tells this grand story of immigration uh, and whether or not America is ready to be truly a multicultural democracy.
I love that. Speaking of yellow journalists, I know you dub yourself as a yellow journalist. What's the
Right.
story behind that?
Well, it's a ironic use of the term, because in American journalism, the term is not a good term. It refers to the period when William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, two journalism giants in the late 19th century, early 20th century, were at war with one another in terms of financial and influence. And uh, the term yellow journalist comes from, I think, the use of yellow sheets of paper that then published very sensational scandal gossip stories. So it is not a good term, but I wanted to use it because in the American race formulation, we have black and white. That goes back to slavery, right? So where do people who aren't black and white fit in on the color spectrum? And sometimes people give Asians either yellow or brown. And that's where some Latinos and Hispanics fall. So I wanted to do, as I say, kind of recapture and reimagine and turn upside down the term yellow, which had both a bad definition and one that designates who people like me and perhaps like you, even though you're not an American here. Uh, so that's the reason why I chose that term. And I'm not saying people accept it well, but I thought it was a catchy title.
Okay. What is your opinion about the state of journalism today? With the particularly regard to like clickbait articles.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. When I left journalism on a daily basis, it was only the beginning of digital journalism, online journalism. In fact, the year I stopped working full time in newspapers, 1996, the year or two before was the beginning of the World Wide Web. So I was very ignorant professionally of using the internet. But let's fast forward. The state of journalism today is wild. The what I don't like is the decline in local newspapers. Because and I worked for a long time for a local newspaper where I was a high profile, a well-known columnist for that newspaper, where I could give my opinions, and many of those opinions got into Yellow Journalist, my collection of journalism writings. Because local journalism is a way to give people of their communities the news of what's happening in their community. But with more and more of those newspapers either stopping, being eliminated, it really reduces the kind of information that a community needs to be a participant, a practicing citizen of their community. Because in American democracy, you need to have information to be able to vote your leadership. If you don't have that, then leaders can then do sort of whatever they want, and they won't be held to account. So I think that's bad. With regards to digital journalism, there are some outlets that are still very good. I think the New York Times has transformed itself from being a great newspaper to being a great news organization that has a very dynamic web presence. Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. But more and more of even these big newspapers are having to do both. But we also know that the internet is both a tool of democratization, meaning anybody can gain, say whatever they want, but it's also, as we have learned in recent decades, a place where you can pass on bad information. Uh, so I don't like that part. And given my age and my professional life before, of course, I'm online as much as I can, but as I earlier indicated, I'm not on any social platform because I don't, I don't feel comfortable doing that. And I don't like to share the way other people do, let's say on TikTok or Instagram, or YouTube. I use YouTube sometimes, of course, just to see uh, different videos. I'm not on TikTok, but we learn about it because somehow the things that are on TikTok eventually make it to a broader media audience.
Exactly. I saw an excerpt in your book that something that says pop never had the kind of cultural or national identity confusion that has animated most of my life. He was Chinese, period.
Right.
Did you ever envy him for that?
Oh, it would, let's put it this way, it would be a simpler existence if I, for example, as a son of a Chinese immigrant who came in during a terrible period for Chinese immigrants, and some of the psychology of that sort of passed on to my generation. So that's where I talk in my book about this identity confusion and a constant search for me as to who I am. When I referred to my father not having that confusion because he was always in his own mind Chinese, even though he was a legal immigrant under false circumstances. I know it gets confusing, but he was within Chinatown, Oakland's Chinatown, for the life that he had in America. And in that regards, he didn't have to worry about whether or not he was Chinese American. All right. Because his age generation were people just like him, business owners who had children similar to me. So it was the children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren. Well, more my generation than the younger generations, because at some point, our children and grandchildren will know automatically that they are American, even if other Americans don't regard them as Americans, right? But within
100%.
their hearts and within their identity search, it's simpler for them. So when you asked me that question, I said it would have been simpler had maybe I was either stayed in China or been third or fourth generation.
For sure. Do you still question your ethnic or national identity?
Well, I have what I like to do is I said I have an ethnic identity. I also have a national identity, and they are somehow together. So when somebody asks me even today, how do you identify yourself? I have to think a second and I say, well, I am Chinese American, but I'm also a Chinatown Cantonese American. Now, to say that to somebody is too much information and confusing. But I do know who I am, and fundamentally, I am an American because, as I recount in my book, on several trips that I made to China, I didn't feel I belonged there. But here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I was born and grew up and spent most of my life, I know I belong here. Now, when I lived in other parts of America, there were times when I had to ask because I was clearly in the very small minority. And I hear this from other Chinese Americans who were not like me, who I grew up in a Chinatown. So I was Chinatown Chinese until I started moving into the white world, starting in high school. I went to a white high school where I was one of the few Chinese American, Asian American students, and there were a few black students as well. So once I started moving into a white world, I had to learn to adapt using my English skills and being able to then be friends with white people. And I had some black friends as well. So I had to adjust to what was in front of me as opposed to going back to my Chinatown days. So when I go to Chinatown even today, I feel a little lost because I've lost most of my native dialect.
Mm. Yeah, because they speak Chinese. Even here in Montreal, they
Oh
do
yeah.
not speak a word of English. I'm like, how do you live?
Yeah, right. Right.
But I love it. I love the resilience and they find ways to survive.
Correct.
In the end, it's about surviving anyway.
It is about
Yeah.
surviving, and then it's a matter of what choices you make in either your personal life or your professional life, or not necessarily professional life, because some people don't get into the professions. They have other skills that are still valuable to any economy. Uh, so that's one of the challenges for so-called advanced societies like Canada, like the United States, and some of the European countries, Australia, New Zealand, and in Asia as well. So
For sure. You mentioned sometimes you were feeling ashamed of your dad in Chinatown because you didn't meet the white American standard.
right.
Are you still ashamed of that, or have you forgiven yourself?
Oh, that's in the past when I was young, and again going back into a white environment in high school, being surrounded mostly by white kids whose parents were much more middle class and who had professions. And so there was a shame factor of coming from a Chinatown family whose business was a restaurant, which is in those days not a high calling, um, and whose parents didn't speak English well, who weren't wealthy. So the shame came from the standpoint of being in a minority, not being celebrated, not being accepted, and maybe even made fun of or called names. That didn't happen to me a lot, but I know that I had people of my own age or a little older who went through some humiliating experiences. Um, so it was under in that circumstance. But as I've gotten older and moved into white society and then even served in the Peace Corps in the Philippines and went on to a successful journalism career, having a couple of books published, I no longer have that shame.
What was the hardest part of writing the book?
I think the hardest part was trying to figure out what story I wanted to tell. At the beginning, it started as a family history project, simply a little life story of my father to give to my extended family, because many of the younger generations didn't know him. And they only knew him through the stories that their parents or grandparents, in other words, my siblings and me, told. Uh, So as I said, that 100th anniversary of his arrival was the trigger that got me thinking about my father and telling the story. But as I got further into the research, using documents that were in Chinese as well as in English, thinking about my own life, that began to shape a larger story. So the most difficult thing for me over the 10 or 12 years that I had to do the book was how do I start the book? What do I put in it? What do I leave out? Including talking about my own family, my relation to my parents, how they got along, uh, how my sisters and I got along. All of those were interesting choices. And writers will tell you that it's such a lonely exercise because we're either in front of a computer, or some people still handwrite books. I don't do that. Uh, but because it's in your head, it's in your heart, it's in your soul. What comes out is still a mystery to me. I'm so happy I was able to come up with a version that was accepted by a publisher. They agreed to print it. We have copies available today.
I love it. I love it. Was there a moment when you almost stopped finishing the book?
I would say there were a number of such moments, but they didn't last. I know that some writers talk about a writer's block. I never had that. Um, what stopped me was something very prosaic in a way. It was the COVID pandemic. I was about ready to send my manuscript, not quite ready, to a publisher, and the pandemic hit. So my late wife, she was alive then, but the two of us sheltered in place the way many, many, many Americans did, and perhaps people around the world. So I just simply stopped. I didn't look at my manuscript for maybe a little bit more than a year. But after we started getting out of the pandemic, I looked at it again, and then I put some polish, some finishing touches to it, and I got it to the point where I wanted it to be and sent it off to my publisher. So it wasn't a matter of wanting to stop, but it was mentally difficult at points because I was a little frustrated by my organization or even how I was telling the story. It didn't last long, so
Thank
yeah,
God.
I kept doing it. So.
Beautiful. What was your writing process then? Were you going on your desk, write for an hour, then go away, or did you approach it like an athlete?
Not quite as disciplined as the great professional athletes I know, those who go to the gym and then work on their dribble or three-point shot the way Steph Curry, my favorite player, does. Uh, the process was the research lasted roughly from 2011 to 2017. So I was doing a lot of reading, going into documents. I traveled to China in 2014 to go back to my father's village, which was my second visit. In 1994, before I started the book, some of my sisters and I and a few other members of our family went to the village where my father was born and grew up. 20 years later, I went again in 2014 with the purpose of doing more research. And I found people there who knew of my father's reputation. So my father coming from the village, he gained a reputation because it was a big deal in that village that somebody from the village went to Gold Mountain, it was called, America. So when from 2017 on, I started writing. So I remember going through numerous drafts. I would come to my computer. I generally like to work in the morning. Um, I would break for lunch and then spend maybe an hour or two more. Then mid-afternoon, I would quit. But uh, for me, the brain always was churning. Even when I put my head down, hoping to catch either a nap or go to bed, something pops up. So occasionally I would get to my desk, either write it down by hand or jot a note or two on my computer, uh, just to remember that thought or idea, right? So that's part of the writing process. Uh, Maybe other authors and writers can tell you more in detail how they do it. I consider it to be a mystery still.
Beautiful.
Some a sentence or two will pop up in your head, and by the time I move from the bed to the computer, a matter of minutes, I may have forgotten the precise thing I had in my head, but something else will come out.
100%. I used to write a lot too, and yes, sometimes you're just watching TV and then the muse whispers, and this is the idea, and you have no choice but get up and write that down, or else you will never feel comfortable somehow.
Correct.
You mentioned that you read a lot of articles and talked to a lot of people.
Yes.
How do you ensure the accuracy of the memories while writing it?
Oh, yeah, man. You hit a sensitive point because uh, memories are, in my view, tricky. Um, and and the reason I say this in a specific way, I cite a couple of anecdotes in my book about something that happened to my family or to my father and mother many, many decades ago. And at one point I think it was in the mid 1970s, I I pulled my sisters together. All of us obviously were much younger then, and we would talk family stories and was recorded on, in those days, little cassettes.
Oh, you did. That was awesome.
I did that and I found the cassettes. I have a brother-in-law who's much more tech savvy than me. He helped me digitize them somehow. So when I went through them, there were hours and hours of six of us, I think, exchanging stories. So when I started writing those anecdotes in the book, I found that there were slightly different versions of the same incident, right? So what I chose to do in writing it was to give as briefly and succinctly as I can the slightly different versions. And there was one big incident which I'm not going to spoil because it was a great drama and trauma that happened to my father. Uh, and I wasn't alive then, but my sisters all were alive but much younger. So they have slightly different memories of what happened. And then when I went back to the tape recording of our memories, slightly different versions came out there, right? So I had to say, rather than to boil it down to one sort of consensus, I gave the different versions um, because the question of memory, as your question indicates, is very tricky. So I can't say for certain that all the memories that I have summarized in my book were actually true, but they are the best I can do to write down what I remember or my sisters remembered to be the truth. And in some cases, that's where documentation helps. because when my father and mother and three of my sisters came through Angel Island Immigration Station during the Exclusion Act, they were interrogated. And the immigration department in those days had people taking notes on a typewriter, and they were transcribed. So there are records of all of the interrogations of my father, mother, and three sisters. So that gave me, some material to work with. And there have been Asian American, Chinese American scholars who've written about the immigration experience through Angel Island. I use some material from them, of course, giving them credit and footnotes. So this is an interesting, I mean, anybody who writes history needs to go through that same process.
100%, 100%. And yes, memory is so tricky because when I do the same thing with my siblings and tell a certain story that everyone will remember, and one will say, "Oh, it was a yellow balloon." I'm like, "No, it was a red balloon."
Yeah.
And one of the other ones said, "No, that's a blue balloon." I'm like, what is
Yeah,
going on right now?
right, right.
Because in
Well, yeah, now that you mentioned that, very specifically, our restaurant had a rectangle table that could seat six people under a staircase. One of my sisters, the one just older than me, she is a poet and an artist. So when she tells that story, she remembers it as an oval table, not a rectangle. And I said, Flo is her name. And I have another sister who remembers it as a rectangle, right? And in fact, I have that table in my house now
the
because I,
exact one,
yeah,
that's
I,
amazing.
it is amazing because it was when our restaurant closed, we children uh, took as much as we could. Not everything. There are some things that we regret not taking. So I can show the sister who thought it was an oval table. Here it is.
That's funny. I love that. I'm glad that you have that evidence, a solid evidence to show. But sometimes,
In that case, yeah.
yeah, in that case, because sometimes I talk to I pride myself that I have the best memory in the family, right? But I don't have a table to show. You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying? That's funny. Has your goal changed from when you started writing the book to now that it is published?
Well, it changed in the regards that at the beginning it was just the story of my father for my family. When I got into it, I wanted to tell not just my family story, which I do, my father's immigration story, my story of growing up in Chinatown and then moving into the white mainstream. Those are the family stories. But I wanted to put that into a much larger historical, political, cultural context, because as I indicated earlier, there still is a question in America, the United States of America, are we or are we not a multicultural, multi-ethnic democracy? Do we Are we a nation of immigrants who welcome people from other countries and give everybody an opportunity to achieve the American dream? Or do we not want people to come here to help build our economy and to become Americans as well? So I wanted to shape my family story within that bigger frame. And I think that I have achieved that, given the many reviews on Amazon that I've been able to get. People are getting the larger story and with my family story as an illustration and a case study of that.
That's beautiful. Mr. Bill, I think we're there. But before we close out, I want to close out with this question. Why should we read your book?
To learn about America, to learn about our immigration history, because it says something about how people from another land, another culture, another language can come here, contribute to the economy, be good citizens eventually, to be and to make this country a better place, even when some of us are not welcome. That is one of the stories that I think will resonate on a more universal basis, because all over the, at least the many different countries are still dealing with this question of refugees and immigrants who are trying to uh, leave a country that's either under stress from war or poverty or the combination of the two, or intolerance, uh, and find a better life elsewhere. And many other countries in Europe, for example, perhaps in the Pacific, as well as in America and in Canada, are struggling with those issues. I wish we were, all of us, more tolerant, more forgiving, more respectful of each other, but I'm a dreamer in that regards.
Beautiful. Well, I'm a dreamer too, so we can dream together.
Yes.
Again, Mr. Bill, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Aaron.
Have a good day.
Yes, thank you.
Bye. Thank you again, Bill, for coming on the podcast. I really do appreciate it. Thank you, listeners, for listening. This is Aaron Del Llosa for An Immigrant's Life. I'll see you guys later.